Au Sable Valley, Michigan, August, 1882. The air, thick with the scent of pine sap and sawdust, carried the rhythmic clang of the sawmill and the shouts of men. But on a small plot of cleared land a half-mile upriver, there was only the quiet scrape of a shovel against earth and the thud of an axe. Here, Marek Zelinka was building something that made the loggers and mill hands who passed by stop, stare, and then laugh. He was building his cabin against a tree, not a standing one, but a fallen giant, a colossal white pine 5 feet in diameter that had been toppled by a windstorm years before the valley saw its first axe. It lay like a slumbering god, its trunk forming a 60-foot wall of solid wood. Any sane man would have spent a month bucking it into sections for the mill. Marek was digging his foundation flush against its lichen-covered bark. Lyle Stennett, the sawmill foreman, stood with his hands on his hips, a look of pity mixed with contempt on his face. He was a man who understood wood in its proper milled state, straight, square, and seasoned. This was an abomination. "Zelinka," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "That's not a cabin, it's a lean-to. You're inviting rot right into your house. That trunk's green on the inside and damp on the outside. It'll be crawling with ants and carpenter bees by first frost." A younger logger next to him, Jedediah Croft, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "He's foolish, Lyle, letting the woods build half his house for him." Marek paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the massive log, then at Stennett. "The north wall will be strong," he said, his Bohemian accent still thick. He offered no further defense. He simply picked up his axe and returned to notching a log for one of the other 3 walls. The men shook their heads. The Bohemian was crazy. What did this Bohemian charcoal burner understand about thermal resistance that a seasoned sawmill foreman, a man who lived his life by the board foot, had missed? The answer to that question would change how this entire valley survived the winter. It would rewrite the rules of building in a land of endless trees and killing cold. Stick with us, and I promise you we'll learn how the deep, slow knowledge of an ancient trade can solve a problem that modern methods only make worse. We dig into these stories of forgotten ingenuity every week. If you value that, consider subscribing and letting us know in the comments what you think is the most overlooked resource in your own backyard. Marek Zelinka was not a carpenter. He had never built a cabin, never felled a tree for lumber, never worked in a sawmill. In the old country, in the deep forests of Bohemia, he was an ulease, a charcoal burner. His hands were not trained to the saw and plane, but to the shovel and the kiln. His world was not one of planks and beams, but of massive stacked logs, buried under sod and earth, and set to smolder for weeks in a slow, oxygen-starved fire. He understood heat not as a fleeting blaze in a hearth, but as a vast, enduring force to be managed, contained, and stored. He knew the soul of a log was not in its grain, but in its mass. He knew a 3-foot oak round, once heated to its core. It would radiate a gentle warmth for 2 days after the fire was out. This was knowledge baked into his bones, a tradecraft passed down through generations who learned to turn the forest's density into the fuel of progress. He had come to Michigan with his wife, Eliska, and their 2 small children, Jakob and Anika, chasing the promise of land and timber. But the promise had a brutal condition: survival. Their first winter in the Au Sable Valley, spent in a hastily built, conventional one-room cabin, had been a lesson in failure. The structure was a sieve for heat. By supper, Frost would climb the single plank walls, tracing the path of the nails that held them together. Eliska would tuck the children into their narrow bed, their breath hanging in the air at pillow height like ghosts. Marek would feed the small stove until it glowed red. A desperate battle against the invading cold, but it was a battle he lost every single night. He would wake in the gray pre-dawn light to a profound and absolute cold. The stove would be a block of iron, and the ash in its belly held no ember, not a single spark of life. Their first winter was a shivering misery, a constant state of being just one log away from freezing. Marek knew he had failed his family. He had built like his neighbors, and he had suffered like his neighbors. This time, he would not build like a logger. He would build like a charcoal burner. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was a failure of physics. The men who built them were skilled with an axe and adze. But they were fighting a war against an enemy they didn't fully understand. The problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the speed at which the cold could get inside. A typical cabin wall in the valley was made of hewn logs, 6 to 8 inches thick, with gaps chinked with mud and moss. Or, for those with access to the mill, it was a single layer of 1-inch pine planks. These structures were designed for speed of construction and efficient use of lumber, not for thermal performance. The primary enemy was heat transfer, and it attacked on 3 fronts. First was infiltration. The Michigan wind was a relentless thief, finding every tiny crack in the chinking, every gap around the window frame, every space under the door. It pushed cold air in and sucked warm air out in a ceaseless exchange. Families would hang blankets over the doors and stuff rags into the walls, but it was like trying to bail out a boat with a teaspoon. The drafts were constant, chilling the floor and making it impossible to maintain a stable temperature. Second was convection. Inside the cabin, the air was in constant motion. The hot air from the stove would rise to the ceiling, race across to the cold outer walls, cool, and then sink to the floor, creating a perpetual, chilling loop. This is why a man's head might be sweating while his feet were numb with cold. The single layer of wood did almost nothing to stop this internal circulation of misery, but the most fundamental failure, the one Marek Zelinka understood intuitively, was conduction. Heat naturally moves from a warmer object to a colder one. A thin wall of wood is simply a poor barrier to this movement. Think of it in terms of thermal resistance, or R value. A 1-inch thick pine plank has an R value of about 1. Being an 8-inch log wall, if chinked perfectly, might reach an R value of 8 or 9. This was the peak of frontier technology, and it was wholly inadequate against a temperature of 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, driven by a 30-mile-per-hour wind off Lake Huron. The heat generated by their wood stoves was simply flowing through the walls and roof, as if they were hardly there. Angus McGuire, a logger with a cabin a quarter-mile from Marek's new site, burned through 12 cords of wood his first winter and still claimed his water bucket froze solid 10 feet from the stove. The conventional cabin wasn't a shelter. It was a machine for burning wood as fast as possible just to keep death at bay. It was a design that guaranteed exhaustion and poverty, one log at a time. Marek's construction began in late August. He chose his site not for the view or proximity to the river, but for the fallen giant. The pine, a relic from the pre-logging era, lay perfectly oriented, its massive trunk running east to west. It would be his north wall, the shield against the prevailing winter winds. His neighbors saw a dead tree. Marek saw 60 tons of insulation, provided free of charge by the forest itself. He and Aliska dug the foundation for the other 3 walls, creating a rectangular footprint 18 feet long and 12 feet deep. One of the long, 18-foot sides was the tree itself. He laid a stone foundation for the other 3 walls, bringing it up to the level of the trunk's underside. He didn't try to flatten the log or shape it. That would have been a fool's errand and would have defeated the purpose. Instead, he treated the rough, or furrowed bark as an unchangeable fact of the landscape. Using a compass and a plumb bob, he meticulously scribed the end of each log for the east and west walls to match the curve of the giant trunk. It was slow, painstaking work. Each log was custom cut to nestle perfectly against the contours of the bark. When he laid the first course, Lyle Stennett came by again, this time with Samuel Paris, the blacksmith. "You're creating 1,000 places for water to get in, Zelinka," Stennett said, pointing at the seam between the new wall and the old trunk. "Snow will melt, run down that bark, and pool on your foundation. You'll have ice in your walls. And I'm telling you, that log is going to rot. You're building a house on a compost heap." Paris nodded. A man wants seasoned, dry timber for his home. That thing's been soaking up ground moisture for a decade. Marek simply ran his hand over the thick bark. "It is dry inside," he said, his voice quiet. He picked up a bucket of the clay and moss mixture Eliska had prepared and began forcing it into the seam, packing it tight with a small wooden paddle. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just worked. His wife Eliska watched him with a mixture of apprehension and unwavering trust. One evening, as he came in for supper, she touched his arm. "Marek," she said softly, "the neighbors say our house will be a damp cave. They say it is not a proper house." He looked at her, his eyes tired, but clear. "In my work, we use the earth to hold the heat. This is the same. The tree is like the earth. It is slow. It will hold our warmth." He paused. "It will not be a cave. It will be a kiln for bread, not for charcoal." That was all he said, but it was enough for her. The roof was the final, crucial element. He laid rafters that rested on the top plate of his south wall and ran all the way to the top of the giant log, embedding them securely. He was not just building against the tree, he was making the tree a structural part of the house. By the end of September, the cabin was complete. It looked strange, half-built, like a wooden limpet clinging to a dead leviathan. The mockery lasted through the autumn, but the validation was waiting in the cold heart of winter. To understand why Marek Zelinka's cabin worked, you have to understand a concept that frontier builders knew by feel but not by name: thermal mass. They mistook the log for insulation. It was not. It was a battery. Insulation, like the wool in a man's coat or the trapped air in a bird's feathers, works by slowing the transfer of heat. It has a high R value. A 5-foot thick log of solid white pine, however, doesn't have an exceptionally high R value per inch. It's only about R1 per inch. So, the 60 inches of Marek's north wall had a calculated R value of approximately R60. This was an immense number compared to the R9 of a standard log cabin, but it was not the whole story. The real magic was in the wood's density. White pine weighs about 25 pounds per cubic foot. Marek's north wall, a section of log 18 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, contained roughly 350 cubic feet of wood. That's nearly 9,000 pounds of organic material. It was this sheer mass that made the difference. When Marek lit his stove in the morning, the heat radiated through the small cabin. The thin plank walls of his neighbors would heat up quickly and just as quickly conduct that heat to the outside air, where it was lost forever. But Marek's north wall did something different. The energy that struck its surface didn't just pass through. It began a slow, laborious journey into the heart of the log. It took a tremendous amount of British thermal units, BTUs, to raise the temperature of those 9,000 pounds of wood by even a single degree. This is the principle of thermal mass. The log acted as a heat sink. All day, as the stove burned modestly, the massive trunk soaked up the excess warmth from the cabin air. It was like pouring water into a giant dry sponge. Then, at night, When the fire died down to embers, the process reversed. The cabin air began to cool, but now the outer few inches of the log were warmer than the air. The stored heat began to flow back out of the wood, radiating a steady, gentle warmth into the room. Lyle Stennett's fear of rot was based on his experience with milled lumber. He was right that constant moisture would destroy a plank. But a 5-foot log is a different ecosystem. Its thick, resinous bark is a natural water shield. And crucially, the slow, constant leakage of warmth from the cabin into the log kept the interior surface of the bark just above freezing, preventing condensation and ice buildup. Marek had created a living wall that regulated its own temperature and moisture. He hadn't built a lean-to. He had built a thermal flywheel. The winter arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but as an invading army from the northwest. In the second week of January, Lokalmek, a system of lake-effect squalls, stalled over the Au Sable Valley. For 16 consecutive days, the sky was a churning gray slate, dumping wet, heavy snow that was scoured into monstrous drifts by a wind that never seemed to stop. The temperature plunged to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and stayed there. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The world shrank to the small circle of heat around their stoves. Angus McGuire and his 2 sons worked in shifts, day and night, felling and bucking wood just to feed their roaring fire. The wind drove snow through the chinking of their walls, creating small drifts in the corners of their room. Every morning, the inside of their windows was covered in a thick, opaque layer of fern-like frost. To go outside was to risk your life. And to stay inside was to slowly freeze while working yourself to exhaustion. The Peterson family, downriver, lost 3 of their chickens when they froze solid in their coop, a structure built with the same techniques as their house. The cold was a physical presence, a constant pressure on the walls and on the spirit. In the Zelinka cabin, life went on. The difference was not dramatic. It was profoundly, miraculously normal. Marek burned wood, but he did so at a placid, steady rate. A single small fire in the stove kept the room at a stable 65 degrees. There were no drafts from the north. The 5-foot log was an impenetrable fortress against the wind. The air inside was still and quiet. The contrast was best seen in the small details of domestic life. In the McGuire cabin, though a bucket of water left by the door was a solid block of ice by morning. In Marek's cabin, a tin cup of water Eliska kept on a small shelf for Anika's nighttime cough never even formed a skin of ice. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, Eliska could hear the gentle hiss of melting snow dripping from the eaves of the roof. The ultimate proof was the butter. Eliska had churned a small batch and left the wooden butter mold on a shelf Marek had pegged directly into the log wall. In any other cabin, it would have become as hard as a rock within an hour. Here, it remained soft and spreadable. The great log, saturated with days of gentle heat, was releasing it back into the room, creating a microclimate of stability. They weren't just surviving the storm, they were living comfortably through it. Their shelter performing exactly as the quiet charcoal burner had known it would. They were warm, not because of a raging fire, but because of a slow, patient tree. When the 16th day finally dawned clear and deathly still, the valley was a landscape of Arctic silence. The temperature had dropped even further, to 20 below. Lyle Stennett, wrapped in layers of wool and canvas, set out from the sawmill. Part of his job was to survey the forest after a major storm, looking for fresh windfalls that could be salvaged for lumber. The giant pine on Zelinka's property had long been on his list, a prime source of clear, straight-grained wood if he could ever figure out how to move it. He trudged through the waist-deep snow, his breath freezing in his mustache. As he neared the peculiar cabin, he was focused on the far end of the log. calculating board feet, planning his cuts. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The snow was not uniform. In a perfect 5-foot wide band running the entire 18-foot length of the cabin, the snow was gone. Not just melted down, but completely gone. The dark, wet earth and pine needles of the forest floor were exposed, steaming faintly in the crystalline air. The log itself on the cabin side was bare and dark, while its top and far side were buried under a 3-foot blanket of white. Stennett stared, his mind refusing to process the image. It was impossible. No fire could be hot enough to melt that much snow through 5 feet of solid wood without setting the cabin ablaze. He walked closer, his boots crunching. He reached out a gloved hand and placed it on the rough bark of the trunk, right where it met the cabin wall. He expected to feel the biting cold of the wood. Instead, through his leather glove, he felt a faint, unmistakable warmth. It was a deep, radiant heat, like the side of a cooling oven. He stood there for a full minute, the cold air stinging his face, while his hand rested on the warm tree. All his certainty, all his professional knowledge of seasoned, milled lumber dissolved in that moment. He had been so profoundly, demonstrably wrong. He walked to the cabin's simple plank door and knocked. Marek opened it. Stennett braced himself for the blast of frigid air that always rushed out of a cabin door in such weather. But what flowed out was not cold. It was a wave of calm, stable, gentle warmth. It didn't smell of wood smoke and desperation, but of baking bread and settled life. He stepped inside. The air was still. The small stove glowed with a low, peaceful fire. Eliska was kneading dough on a flour-dusted table, and on a small shelf built against the massive log wall sat a bowl covered with a cloth. Inside it, a mound of dough had risen high and full, a testament to a steady, patient warmth that had lasted all night. Stennett walked to the inner wall, the source of the impossible heat. He pulled off his glove and placed his bare palm flat against the wood. It was not hot. It was just warm, a living warmth that seemed to come from the very heart of the tree. He looked from the risen dough to Marek's calm face, the foreman's own face, chapped and red from the cold, drained of its color. He finally understood. "Marek," Stennett said, his voice husky with awe, "you didn't build a wall. You built the back of a hearth." Lyle Stennett was a practical man. His conversion was not marked by a lengthy apology, but by immediate action. That afternoon at the sawmill, he gathered the crew of sawyers and teamsters before the shift end. They were cold, exhausted men, weary from their own battles against the winter. "We've been building wrong," he began, his voice cutting through their tired murmurs. He didn't mention Marek by name at first. He just described what he had seen. The melted snow, the risen dough, the quiet, steady warmth inside a cabin with a small fire. He described a north wall that wasn't a liability but an asset, a wall that stored the day's heat to fight the night's cold. The men were skeptical, but they respected Stennett. His word carried the weight of experience. "The Bohemian?" one of them asked. "The one with the lean-to?" "It's not a lean-to," Stennett corrected him, his voice firm. "It's the warmest house in this valley, and he built it with a dead tree we all thought was worthless." The idea, once planted, spread like fire in dry grass. It was radical, yet simple. It cost nothing. In fact, it saved labor. The valley was littered with fallen giants from the first wave of logging, trees too big or awkward to be easily moved to the mill. They were nuisances. Now they were seen as resources. That spring, the technique began to appear throughout the region. Mill hands heading out to the remote logging camps took the knowledge with them. At Camp 4 near Grayling, they built a new bunkhouse against a massive, half-buried hemlock log. The camp boss reported they cut their firewood consumption by a third that next winter. Two brothers, recent immigrants from Scotland, adapted the idea and built their homestead against a granite rock outcropping, applying the same principle of thermal mass. By the following spring, at least 4 logging camps and a half-dozen new homesteads had incorporated Marek's design. The Zelinka Wall, as some called it, became a piece of local folk wisdom, a testament to an idea that worked. Marek Zelinka, the quiet charcoal burner from Bohemia, had no formal training in engineering or thermodynamics. Yet, with knowledge passed down through generations of kiln tenders, he had built a structure that anticipated principles of modern building science by nearly a century. His cabin was a perfect example of a high thermal mass system. Architects and engineers today use concrete, stone, or brick to achieve the same effect, and designing tram walls and passive solar homes that absorb the sun's energy during the day and radiate it back at night. Marek used what the forest provided: wood. He instinctively understood that the key to comfort in a cold climate was not just resisting heat loss, but creating thermal stability. His massive log wall acted as a regulator, smoothing out the wild temperature swings between a stoked fire and dead embers, between a sunny afternoon and a sub-zero night. He had created a passive heating system, a structure that did the work for him. It was an elegant solution born not of theory, but of a deep, practical understanding of how a material holds and releases energy over time. The great pine had stood on that ridge for 300 years. It had been a sapling when this land was the undisputed home of the Anishinaabe. It had sheltered generations of eagles and owls. Its roots had held the soil, and its canopy had shaped the light of the forest floor. When the great wind finally brought it down, its life as a tree was over. The loggers saw it as timber, board feet waiting for the saw. Lyle Stennett saw it as a problem, a potential source of rot and insects. They saw a dead thing. Marek Zelinka saw a continuation of its purpose. He understood that the tree's immense solid heart, which had taken centuries to grow, was still a reservoir of strength and stability. He saw that its service was not finished. The forest had provided the perfect shelter, but it took the eyes of a man trained in the slow, deep arts of fire and earth to recognize its shape. A tree does not stop sheltering the day it falls. If you enjoyed this look into the forgotten wisdom of our past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of frontier ingenuity. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What is a piece of old knowledge from your family or region that you believe still holds value today? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building method today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.